In the dim corridors of medical history, there are stories that do not simply describe progress or discovery, but rather reveal the unsettling cost of advancement. Among these forgotten fragments lies a haunting image: the preserved body of a patient, suspended in a jar, floating in murky yellowed fluid, trapped for eternity. It is 1903 in Boston, a city celebrated for its prestigious hospitals and flourishing medical schools. Behind closed doors, however, medicine was not merely about healing. It was also about collecting, cataloging, and preserving the unusual, the grotesque, the rare. To stumble upon such a specimen even today is to be confronted not only with the fragility of human life but also with the cold detachment of science when stripped of empathy. This is the story of one such patient, a person whose life ended not with burial or remembrance, but inside a glass vessel, reduced to a teaching tool for generations who would never know their name. The image of a body inside a jar immediately unsettles us. Jars are meant for food, for storage, for objects. They are not meant for people. Yet in the early 20th century, it was common practice for hospitals and universities to collect human remains like trophies. The medical gaze sought to turn suffering into knowledge, and in doing so, it often erased identity. What was once a living, breathing person, with fears, family, and a voice, became a specimen, stripped of dignity, observed through glass, pointed at by curious students. The patient's final act in this world was not chosen by them, but imposed upon them, their body sealed forever in chemical fluid. The disturbing question that lingers is, who was this patient? Were they a poor immigrant who had no one to claim their remains? Were they someone afflicted by a rare disease that fascinated doctors more than their humanity ever could? Or were they simply unlucky enough to die in a place where bodies were viewed as opportunities, not lives? These are the mysteries that pull us into this story, and they reflect broader questions about how medicine has historically balanced progress with morality. Boston in 1903 was a place of contradictions. On one hand, it was at the forefront of modern medicine, with Harvard Medical School training some of the world's most promising physicians. On the other hand, its hospitals were often filled with the poor, the marginalized, and the desperate, people who had little choice but to accept whatever treatment was offered, if any at all. In these wards, patients were not only cared for but also studied, experimented on, and, in some cases, preserved after death without consent. The patient in the jar became part of a much larger practice, the transformation of human bodies into objects of scientific curiosity. This practice was not hidden. In fact, it was celebrated. Museums of pathology flourished, where shelves upon shelves of jars displayed dissected organs, malformed fetuses, and entire limbs. Students walked among them as if browsing a library of flesh. Doctors lectured while pointing to floating hearts, lungs, and tumors. To them, this was the pinnacle of learning. But to us, looking back, it feels chillingly macabre. What does it mean that a patient's identity could be erased so easily, their body turned into a permanent exhibit? It means that in the name of science, lines of morality were blurred, and lives were silenced. The patient in Boston's jar is not just a medical specimen. They are a symbol of this uncomfortable truth. Their story reminds us that history is not only about what medicine accomplished but also about what it took. Each jarred body carried a hidden biography, a life lived under hardship, an illness endured with pain, and a death that did not lead to rest but to eternal display. When we imagine this patient, floating endlessly under glass, we are forced to ask ourselves, at what point does the pursuit of knowledge become exploitation? The unsettling reality is that most of these patients never gave permission. Consent, as we understand it today, did not exist in medical culture of the early 1900s. Bodies were often claimed from hospitals, morgues, or poorhouses, with little regard for family wishes. Some were prisoners, others were immigrants, many were simply destitute. To the medical establishment, they were convenient. To history, they were forgotten. Yet, in a strange way, their preservation keeps their memory alive, not as individuals, but as curiosities. This documentary will unravel the layers of this disturbing case. We will travel back into the world of early 20th century Boston, uncovering the culture of medical museums, the fascination with rare conditions, and the hidden lives of patients who became specimens. We will meet the unnamed patient whose body was sealed in glass and follow the disturbing journey that led them there. We will examine the preservation process itself, the cold routines of pathology labs, and the unsettling ways these bodies were displayed for generations. Most importantly, we will confront the ethical questions that still haunt us. Do these specimens belong in museums, or should they finally be laid to rest? The patient who lived inside a jar did not choose this fate. They did not choose to be remembered as an object of curiosity. But through their silent presence, they challenge us to reckon with the darkest corners of medical history. Their story is not just about science, but about humanity, and what happens when humanity is stripped away. In that glass jar, floating in silence, lies not only a body but a mirror reflecting the unsettling truths about how far we are willing to go in the pursuit of knowledge. And as we open this story, we must ask ourselves, are we looking at history, or are we staring into a moral question that has never been fully answered? To understand how a patient could end up preserved inside a jar in Boston in 1903, we need to step back into the world of that era. The city was a place of ambition and contradiction, where progress and suffering lived side by side. Boston had established itself as one of America's leading centers of medicine. Harvard Medical School, founded long before, had grown into a powerhouse of medical training. Hospitals like Massachusetts General and the Boston City Hospital stood as monuments to scientific progress. From the outside, it looked like a golden age of learning and healing. Yet within the stone walls of these institutions, the human cost of progress often went unnoticed, buried beneath a culture that prized knowledge above all else. The turn of the century was a period of transformation. Diseases like tuberculosis, smallpox, and typhoid ravaged the population, especially among the working poor who lived in cramped tenements and unsanitary conditions. Immigrants from Ireland, Italy, and Eastern Europe filled the city's neighborhoods, seeking opportunity but often finding poverty. These communities were the lifeblood of Boston, but also the most vulnerable to illness. Hospitals became their last refuge, though admission came with unspoken risks. In exchange for treatment, many unknowingly surrendered their bodies to the gaze of medical science. To be poor in Boston in 1903 was to exist on the margins, both socially and medically. For physicians and students, this was a time of excitement. The tools of modern medicine were rapidly evolving. The microscope had become an essential instrument, X-rays had been discovered only a few years earlier in 1895, and antiseptic practices were changing surgery forever. Doctors were pushing the boundaries of knowledge, eager to document rare cases, understand pathological conditions, and collect examples that could educate future generations. To them, the body was not sacred in death. It was a lesson, a specimen, a puzzle to be preserved and studied. This mindset gave rise to the culture of medical museums. Pathological collections were curated with the same seriousness as art galleries. Shelves groaned under the weight of glass jars filled with preserved organs, bones, and entire limbs. The Mutter Museum in Philadelphia, the Warren Anatomical Museum at Harvard, and countless smaller collections across the country became both teaching spaces and morbid attractions. In these rooms, young doctors walked among silent rows of floating bodies, their curiosity sharpened by the sight of humans suffering preserved in glass. Each jar represented not just a case study but also a conquest over the unknown. Boston was at the heart of this culture. The Warren Anatomical Museum, for instance, housed thousands of specimens by the early 1900s, including skulls, skeletons, and preserved tissues. One of its most famous displays was the skull of Phineas Gage, the railroad worker whose personality changed after a metal rod passed through his brain. Visitors, whether medical students or curious outsiders, learned not only about anatomy but also about the thin line between fascination and exploitation. The city's intellectual pride in these collections masked the fact that many of the specimens came from individuals who never consented to be preserved. The morality of such practices was rarely questioned in 1903. Society at large still saw the poor, the criminal, and the diseased as existing at the edges of respectability. Their bodies were not considered their own in death but were treated as resources. If a family could not afford to claim a body, it was often taken by hospitals or medical schools. Consent, in the modern sense, was an alien concept. Doctors believed that the advancement of knowledge justified these acts, and few voices challenged that assumption. What mattered was the rarity of the disease, the uniqueness of the deformity, or the educational value of the preserved specimen. Boston's social climate fed into this dynamic. The city prided itself on intellectual achievement, yet it was also stratified along class and ethnic lines. Wealthy Bostonians enjoyed advancements in medicine, often accessing private care, while the poor became the subjects of that same medicine. When a patient from a working-class family died in a hospital bed, their body might quietly move not to a coffin, but to the pathology lab. From there, it could be dissected, preserved, and placed on a shelf in perpetuity. The act was justified as for the greater good, but for the patient and their family, It was an erasure of identity and dignity. There was also a public appetite for the macabre. Freak shows and sideshows were popular across America, and the line between entertainment and science blurred often. Visitors could pay to see the preserved remains of medical oddities just as they could marvel at living performers with unusual conditions. In this environment, medical museums did not seem so out of place. They were part of a larger culture that commodified the unusual body. For doctors, however, these jars represented more than spectacle. They were a badge of scientific rigor. A well-stocked pathological museum gave a medical institution prestige. It proved that the hospital or school had encountered, studied, and preserved the rarest and most complex cases. This environment helps us understand how the patient of 1903, whose body would ultimately be preserved in a jar, was caught in a system that valued pathology over personhood. They lived in a city where illness was common, where poverty could determine not only your quality of life but also your fate in death. To become a specimen in Boston's medical world was not necessarily a mark of honor. It was often the inevitable outcome of being poor, sick, and expendable. When we imagine Boston in 1903, it is easy to focus on its grandeur, gaslit streets, booming industry, the rise of modern medicine. But behind that progress were darker truths. Hospitals doubled as laboratories, patients doubled as case studies, and death could mean transformation into an eternal teaching tool. Within this climate, the jarred patient was not an anomaly but a symbol, a reflection of the era's unflinching hunger for knowledge and its troubling disregard for the humanity of the individuals who provided it. The stage is now set. We know the city, we know the culture, and we know the mindset that made such practices possible. What remains is to uncover the story of the patient themselves, the individual whose fate would intertwine with this history of science and spectacle, whose life would not end in rest but in a glass jar, suspended forever between anonymity and remembrance. To grasp why the patient of 1903 ended up preserved in a jar, we must examine the deeper culture that surrounded medicine at the time, a culture obsessed with collecting, displaying, and cataloguing human remains. This fascination did not begin in Boston, nor did it begin in the 20th century. The practice of preserving human specimens has a long and eerie history, stretching back centuries, when curiosity about the body first collided with the tools of preservation. By the early 1900s, it had become an institutionalized part of medical education, shaping how doctors viewed patients and how society itself understood sickness and abnormality. The roots of this culture can be traced to Europe in the 17th century. One of the earliest pioneers was the Dutch anatomist Frederik Ruisch, who became famous for his elaborate collections of preserved body parts. He was not content with simple jars. Instead, he arranged arteries, organs, and even infant skeletons into decorative displays, turning pathology into something both scientific and strangely artistic. His work attracted nobles and scholars, cementing the idea that preserved human remains were not just medical curiosities but also objects of wonder. This legacy set the tone. The body, once lifeless, could be transformed into something lasting, a permanent lesson. By the 19th century, this fascination had crossed the Atlantic. America, with its growing medical schools, embraced pathological specimen culture as an essential teaching tool. The logic was clear. Medicine relied on observation, and preserved specimens allowed endless observation. A patient might die, but their disease could live on in a jar, studied by generations. Medical students could return to the same tumor, the same malformed heart, the same spinal deformity, year after year. Each jar was a textbook of flesh. But there was another side to this culture. It wasn't only about science, it was also about spectacle. Medical museums quickly became places of both learning and morbid attraction. The Mutter Museum in Philadelphia, founded in 1863, became one of the most famous in the United States, housing thousands of preserved specimens. Skeletons with rickets, jars containing fetuses with severe deformities, and entire cross-sections of human torsos filled its halls. For doctors and students, it was a treasure trove of knowledge. For the public, it was a disturbing but irresistible exhibition. People came to gawk at the strange and the grotesque, often with the same fascination they brought to carnival sideshows. Boston's medical institutions followed the same path. Harvard's Warren Anatomical Museum, founded in 1847, boasted thousands of specimens by the time the patient in question was preserved in 1903. These jars told stories of trauma, disease, and anomaly. There were skulls with bullet holes, skeletons with twisted spines, and organs swollen by tumors. Students were required to study these collections, moving through aisles of glass containers where human suffering had been transformed into permanent educational material. Each specimen was meticulously labeled, but the labels rarely mention names, families, or personal stories. A person's identity ended at death, replaced by the cold description of their pathology. The rise of chemical preservation techniques only fed this culture. Earlier specimens had often decayed or collapsed over time, but the introduction of formaldehyde in the late 19th century changed everything. This chemical could preserve tissue in startling detail, halting decomposition and allowing organs to be displayed for decades. Alcohol and glycerin solutions were also used, each creating slightly different visual effects, some leaving tissue pale and ghostly, others suspending it in clear liquid that made every detail visible. With these methods, specimens became near permanent, turning temporary illness into eternal display. Yet behind the scientific utility lay a troubling truth. Most of the people preserved never gave consent. The bodies of the poor, the imprisoned, and the mentally ill were especially vulnerable. In Boston, as in many other cities, hospitals routinely claimed unclaimed bodies for dissection and preservation. Immigrants, who often had no extended family nearby, were disproportionately represented in these collections. For doctors, these individuals were cases, fascinating examples of pathology. For the individuals themselves, it was a final indignity, their deaths transformed into curiosities for strangers. The language used by doctors in medical journals reflects this dehumanizing tendency. Patients were described not as people but as conditions, a case of sarcoma, an instance of hydrocephalus, a remarkable deformity. Their individuality was erased, replaced by the disease that made them interesting. When their remains were placed in jars, the process was seen not as erasure but as preservation of knowledge. In truth, both occurred simultaneously. The disease was remembered, but the human was forgotten. This culture thrived because it satisfied multiple needs at once. It provided doctors with material to teach and research. It gave institutions prestige, proving that they had encountered rare and valuable cases. And it fed the public's appetite for the strange, letting ordinary people glimpse medical oddities without stepping into a surgical theater. In this way, jars of preserved bodies became symbols of progress, curiosity, and status, all while masking the human suffering that created them. By 1903, when the Boston patient was placed in a jar, this practice was not extraordinary. It was routine. The shelves of medical schools and hospitals were already crowded with countless other patients who had undergone the same transformation. To the doctors of the time, this was not disturbing. It was expected. But for us, looking back, the image feels deeply unsettling. We cannot help but see the imbalance, knowledge gained at the cost of dignity lost. The rise of pathological specimen culture created the perfect conditions for the Boston patient's fate. Their illness, whatever it was, marked them as remarkable. Their poverty or marginalization likely meant they had little protection after death. And the medical culture of the city, steeped in the tradition of preserving rare cases, ensured that their body would not be buried but instead suspended in a jar. The culture of specimens was larger than any one patient. But through this single case, we can see its disturbing logic at work, the transformation of human beings into objects of study, trapped forever in glass. Every preserved body inside a jar tells a story, even if the details have been erased. Behind the glass, behind the yellowing preservation fluid, there was once a person who walked the streets of Boston, who perhaps worked, loved, suffered, and hoped, like anyone else. Yet by 1903, when their body was sealed into a specimen jar, much of that humanity was lost, reduced to the clinical description of a disease and the fascination it provoked among doctors. To reconstruct the life of the patient behind the glass is to move between fragments of historical record, speculation, and the disturbing silence left by medicine itself. The Boston patient who ended up preserved in 1903 most likely came from the margins of society. The city at the turn of the century was a patchwork of immigrant communities. Irish families, long settled in Boston, filled the working-class neighborhoods. New waves of Italian, Jewish, and Eastern European immigrants crowded into tenement housing. Jobs were often brutal, long hours in factories, construction, or domestic service, and accidents or illnesses were common. Those who became seriously ill often found themselves at public hospitals such as Boston City Hospital or Massachusetts General, places where the poor and desperate turned when there were no other options. If our patient was admitted to such an institution, their fate was tied not only to the care they received but also to the hospital's hidden practices. What condition did they suffer from? We can only speculate, but the fact that their body was preserved suggests something unusual, something rare enough to fascinate physicians. It may have been a massive tumor. Grotesquely large growths that warped the body were highly prized as specimens because they could be dissected to reveal new insights into cancer, a disease that baffled doctors in 1903. It could have been hydrocephalus, a condition in which cerebrospinal fluid builds up in the skull, causing the head to swell to unnatural proportions. Patients with this illness often lived short, painful lives, and their remains were routinely preserved for teaching. Or it might have been a deformity of the spine or limbs, a condition that marked them visually in life and ensured their body would be studied in death. Whatever the illness, it was severe enough to make this patient interesting in the eyes of medicine. To the doctors, the patient was likely referred to as a case. Perhaps they appeared in hospital records with detached language. Case number 147, male, aged 32, immigrant laborer, presenting with an advanced sarcoma of the abdomen. Or case of congenital hydrocephalus, female child, expired after 2 weeks in ward. These were the kinds of notations that stripped a life of detail. In the eyes of the medical establishment, the person became the disease, and the disease was what mattered. The living story of hardship, family ties, or personal dreams disappeared behind the clinical description. But behind those sterile words was still a human being. Imagine them lying in a crowded hospital ward, surrounded by strangers, gas lamps flickering overhead. The air reeked of disinfectant and sickness. Doctors and students visited the bed, not only to treat but also to observe, to whisper about the rarity of the condition, to measure and sketch, perhaps even to photograph. Patients in such situations often felt like exhibits even before death. They were studied more than they were cared for. Their suffering was transformed into a lesson, their body a site of curiosity. We cannot ignore the social forces that shaped this fate. Poor patients had little power to refuse examinations. Language barriers meant many immigrants could not even understand what doctors said about them. Families struggling to survive could rarely afford private care or burial. And when death came, the body often remained unclaimed in the hospital morgue. For the institution, such a body was not a tragedy but an opportunity. Doctors saw a chance to preserve a specimen that could benefit students for decades to come. For the patient, however, it meant their final act of existence was stripped of dignity. The haunting part of this story is the anonymity. The name of the Boston patient preserved in 1903 has not survived, or was never recorded in public. They are remembered only by their pathology, not by their humanity. This anonymity was not accidental. It was part of the culture of medical specimens. Names were unnecessary. In fact, they were inconvenient. What mattered was the disease, not the person who bore it. Thus, the patient's life story, their childhood, their family, their struggles, was erased, leaving only the body and the condition that made it remarkable. Yet even in this silence, we can glimpse fragments. We can imagine a man who worked long hours unloading ships at Boston Harbor until a swelling in his abdomen grew too painful to ignore. Or a woman who sewed in a factory, her body gradually failing from a condition no one could explain. Or a child, brought by desperate parents, whose deformity attracted more gawking from doctors than compassion. Each of these lives could have led to the jar. Each possibility is both speculative and tragically plausible. The tragedy of the patient behind the glass lies not only in their death but in the way their story was rewritten by others. The doctors who preserved the specimen believed they were doing something noble, contributing to science, helping future generations learn. But in doing so, they also performed an act of erasure. They silenced the patient's voice and replaced it with their own narrative. The jar became a monument not to the patient's life but to the medical institution's authority. For us today, looking at that jar in retrospect, the human presence is undeniable. The distorted features, the pale tissue, the shape of a body once animated with life, these remind us that this was not just a specimen but a person. Their story may never be fully recovered, but their image lingers as a symbol of all the patients whose identities were lost to the culture of preservation. The patient behind the glass embodies the disturbing intersection of progress and exploitation. They were chosen because they were unusual, preserved because they were useful, and forgotten because they were powerless. Their condition, whatever it was, drew doctors' eyes, but their humanity slipped away, sealed under glass, hidden in museum cabinets for decades. As we continue, we will see how this patient's life was not only reduced but transformed, how their final days and moments were shaped not by compassion but by the cold routines of pathology. The jar preserves not only their body but the unsettling truth about medicine in 1903 Boston. that behind every preserved specimen was a silenced life, and behind every jarred patient was a story erased. When we look at the patient inside the jar, we attempted to see only what the doctor saw, the rare condition, the anomaly that set this body apart from others. But behind the specimen there was once a full life, however difficult or short, and it is here that the tragedy deepens. The patient was not born a curiosity. They were born a child, likely in a home of poverty, hardship, and limited opportunity, and over time their illness or deformity reshape how others saw them. By the time they entered the hospital in Boston, they had already been reduced in the eyes of society to something strange, pitiable, or fascinating, but rarely treated as a person deserving dignity. Boston in the early 1900s was a city where one's class and background determined nearly everything. The wealthy lived in Back Bay brownstones, had access to private physicians, and when they died, they were buried with respect in well-kept cemeteries. The poor, however, lived in cramped tenements, endured dangerous labor, and often had no resources when sickness struck. For immigrants especially, life was precarious. They faced prejudice, language barriers, and the constant struggle to prove themselves in a city that often viewed them with suspicion. If the patient in the jar was from this world, as many such patients were, then their life had already been devalued long before it ended. Imagine the daily existence of such an individual. Perhaps they were a dock worker, hauling heavy loads until a growth on their body made the work unbearable. Perhaps they were a seamstress whose hands twisted with deformity, unable to keep up with the demands of the factory. Or perhaps they were a child who could not play like others, marked early on by a swollen skull or misshapen limbs, regarded with pity or superstition by neighbors. These scenarios are speculative, yet they are drawn from the lived experiences of countless poor and sick individuals in Boston at the time. Such people were often described as curiosities even while alive, pointed at, whispered about, or hidden away. What made matters worse was the language of medicine itself. Doctors, trained to study pathology above all, spoke of patients in detached, clinical terms. A man was not a man. He was a remarkable case of abdominal sarcoma. A child was not a child. She was a specimen of congenital hydrocephalus. The patient's humanity was erased in the process of medical observation. Their pain became data. Their body became an example. For doctors and students, the unusual case was thrilling. For the patient, it was humiliating. They were looked at not with empathy but with curiosity, as if they were already half a specimen, even before death. This dehumanization was not limited to the hospital. Society at large also turned unusual bodies into spectacle. Sideshows and traveling exhibitions presented people with rare conditions as entertainment. Terms like the bearded lady, the giant, or the pinhead were commonplace. Audiences paid to stare at people whose bodies were deemed strange. The patient in Boston may not have been part of such a show, but they would have lived in a world that saw bodies like theirs as objects of fascination rather than lives of equal worth. The line between scientific curiosity and public gawking was razor thin. Both served to reduce people into curiosities, stripping them of voice and identity. Inside the hospital, this reduction continued. Students would gather around the patient's bed, eager to sketch or examine. Some may have taken photographs, a practice growing more common in medical education. The patient's suffering became a demonstration. Their body was probed, measured, and discussed as if it belonged to science rather than to them. The individual may have felt like an exhibit even in life, surrounded by young men in white coats murmuring Latin terms while rarely addressing them directly. In such an environment, the patient's sense of self would have been overshadowed by the condition that defined them. And yet, behind all this, we must remember the invisible details that medicine ignored. This patient may have had a family, a mother who wept over their illness, a spouse who struggled to care for them, or children who feared the hospital's corridors. They may have had hopes, however modest, of a life beyond suffering, to work, to marry, to belong. These human elements were erased the moment doctors began describing them in terms of pathology. Once preserved in a jar, these details vanished entirely, leaving behind only the condition, not the person. The tragedy is that the patient's story did not end with their death. In fact, their death marked the beginning of their second life as a specimen. Instead of being mourned, buried, and remembered by family, they were drained, cut, preserved, and sealed in glass. Their name may have been forgotten, but their body remained, floating silently in a cabinet, pointed at by generations of students. Each time a class gathered around the jar, the patient was transformed again into an object of curiosity. What had once been a life full of unseen details was reduced to an eternal exhibit. The reduction of this patient's life to a curiosity was not unique. It was systemic. Thousands of others shared the same fate across the United States and Europe. Some became skeletons in teaching collections. Others became wax models or photographic slides. All were transformed into objects that outlived them. In each case, the person disappeared while the pathology endured. To study these specimens today is to confront that disturbing exchange, the disease remembered, the human forgotten. And yet, in the silence of the jar, the human presence refuses to vanish entirely. To us, looking back, the specimen is not just a case. It is a person who lived through poverty, pain, and the crushing weight of being seen only as unusual. Their preservation forces us to face the uncomfortable truth that medical progress was built not only on discovery but also on dehumanization. Every jar on every shelf carries this weight, a reminder that behind the curiosity was a life, and behind the specimen was a story that deserved more than erasure. The Boston patient of 1903 embodies this truth perfectly. In their final transformation, they were reduced to a curiosity. But when we look at them now, we can attempt to restore some of what was lost. By acknowledging the life erased, we confront the darker side of medical history. Their story is no longer just about the condition that fascinated doctors. It is about the person who endured it, the society that failed them, and the disturbing culture that sealed them in glass. The moment of death, though inevitable, was often treated not as an ending but as an opportunity within the walls of a hospital in 1903 Boston. For the patient who would eventually be sealed inside a jar, their passing was not simply the closing chapter of a difficult life, it was the beginning of a transformation orchestrated by the medical world around them. To understand how this came to pass, we must reconstruct the atmosphere of those final hours, when the individual ceased to be a patient and began the slow process of becoming a specimen. The Boston hospitals of the early 20th century were stark, echoing institutions filled with the smells of carbolic acid, unwashed sheets, and bodies in varying stages of decay and recovery. Death was a common occurrence, especially in wards where patients with unusual or untreatable conditions were kept. The patient inside the jar would have spent their final moments in such a ward, surrounded not by family but by medical staff who saw them less as an individual and more as a medical puzzle. Nurses may have stood near the bedside, while doctors observed, waiting to record the time of death. The cold efficiency of these moments stands in stark contrast to the personal grief one might expect in a home setting. In a hospital, death was an event to be monitored, noted, and, when valuable, preserved. For the patient, the end may have come quietly, their body too exhausted to continue the fight against disease or deformity. Pain was common, as morphine was not always generously administered, especially to poorer patients. Their breathing would have slowed, each breath more shallow than the last, until silence fell. It is possible that there were no loved ones present, no whispered words of comfort. Instead, the first sounds after death may have been the scratch of a pen across paper, as a doctor recorded the official details, name, age, condition, and time of death. The human life ended, but the medical file began its afterlife. In this moment, the fate of the body was often decided. Hospitals in Boston had agreements with medical schools and museums that allowed unclaimed bodies, or those of patients who had given some form of consent, however questionable, to be transferred for study. For the poor, this was often an inevitability. Without money for a funeral, their bodies were claimed by science. In some cases, hospitals did not even attempt to contact families, assuming that such individuals would not be missed or could not afford to protest. For our patient, the transition from the bed to the autopsy room may have been immediate. Here, the rituals of death shifted into the rituals of science. The body was wheeled to a cold room, stripped, and laid upon a slab. Doctors and students gathered, not to mourn but to observe. Death, in their eyes, was the beginning of revelation. The body would be opened, its secrets exposed, its abnormalities studied. The patient's final moments of humanity faded completely in the clinical glare of the autopsy room. Every incision, every measurement, every note taken by a young student further transformed them from person to specimen. This process was not without ceremony, but it was a ceremony of curiosity, not of mourning. The doctors may have stood in or at the size of a tumor, the thickness of a skull, or the grotesque shape of an organ. Words like fascinating and remarkable would have been used, words that stripped away any trace of tragedy and replaced it with scientific wonder. The patient's suffering, their fear, their lived experience, none of it mattered in that cold room. What mattered was the condition, the abnormality, the medical riddle that their body represented. For students, this was a rare opportunity. Textbooks could only describe so much, but a preserved body told a story no page could match. Some may have sketched what they saw, their pencils moving quickly across notepads to capture the strangeness of the pathology. Others whispered, comparing this case to ones they had read about in journals. To them, this was not a human body but a chance to see something extraordinary. And in their eagerness, the patient was erased further still, their humanity replaced by the title of a case study. Yet there is something profoundly chilling in this moment. For while doctors saw the body as valuable, the individual was simultaneously disappearing. The human life, filled with invisible details, laughter, sorrow, longing, ended with no funeral rites, no prayers, no ritual of remembrance. Instead, their death was treated as the beginning of their usefulness to science. The body was no longer theirs. It belonged to the institution, to the museum, to history itself. The choice to preserve rather than bury was deliberate. Doctors decided that this body was too rare, too unusual, too important to decompose in the earth. Instead, it would be embalmed, treated with chemicals, and placed inside a jar filled with preservative fluid. In this way, the moment of death became not an ending but a sentence, a life condemned to eternal display. The individual could not choose this fate, it was chosen for them. And yet, there is a haunting irony here. For the doctors who oversaw this process, preserving the body was seen as an act of respect to science, a way to honor the knowledge that could be gained from such a case. But for the patient, if they could have spoken, it may have felt like the ultimate violation, to be denied rest, denied burial, and instead transformed into an object of endless scrutiny. What the doctors called progress, the patient might have called desecration. This moment of death, therefore, is not simply a medical detail. It is a turning point in the narrative of power, control, and erasure. The hospital claimed authority over the body. The medical world claimed authority over the story. And history itself claimed authority over memory, choosing to remember the pathology while forgetting the person. The jar became the tomb, and the specimen became the only trace of a life once lived. Looking back now, more than a century later, this moment of death invites us to question what it means to be remembered. Is it better to be forgotten entirely, buried in the anonymity of a pauper's grave, or to be remembered forever in a jar, stripped of identity, reduced to pathology? The Boston patient did not have the luxury of such a choice. Their fate was decided in the clinical silence of the hospital, their humanity slipping away with each decision made by others. And so, in 1903, one life ended, but another began, not a life of freedom or memory, but a life trapped in glass, destined to be looked at for generations. Their death was not an end. It was a beginning they never chose. The preservation of a body in 1903 Boston was more than a technical process. It was, in many ways, a ritual, a transformation from human flesh to permanent object. For the patient who had just died, the hours immediately following their death determined whether they would fade into the anonymity of burial or endure indefinitely as a specimen. The doctors, students, and technicians who handled the body may not have thought of it as ritual, but the steps they followed were methodical, precise, and deeply symbolic. This was not about respect for the dead in the traditional sense. It was about respect for knowledge, for science, and for the insatiable desire to preserve what was considered rare. The process began with a decision. This body was too unusual, too valuable, to lose to decay. Once that choice was made, the patient's fate was sealed. The corpse was cleaned, stripped of clothing, and placed on a cold table in the anatomy room. Around them, jars of all sizes lined the shelves, filled with floating remains of others who had once been alive. Limbs twisted by disease, organs swollen with tumors, infants with congenital deformities, all preserved in cloudy solutions that made them both grotesque and strangely beautiful. The patient was about to join them, becoming part of a gallery of silent, eternal witnesses to the medical gaze. The first step in preservation was drainage. The body's fluids had to be removed to prevent rapid decomposition. Incisions were made, and the blood was drained away, replaced with chemicals designed to halt decay. Carbolic acid, alcohol, and formaldehyde were common tools in this ritual. These substances, harsh and stinging to the nose, burned away bacteria and hardened tissues. The once warm and pliable body began to change, taking on the stiffness and artificial resilience of an object prepared for display. The smell in the room was overpowering, but for the doctors and assistants, it was the familiar scent of progress. Next came the preparation of the jar itself. Large glass containers, often custom-made, were filled with preserving fluid, a mixture of water, alcohol, and sometimes glycerin to prevent brittleness. Formalin, a solution of formaldehyde in water, was often used to fix tissues permanently. These jars were heavy, sealed with thick glass lids or wax stoppers to prevent evaporation. The patient's body, depending on its size, might have been preserved whole or in sections. If the condition was most visible in a particular organ, that organ would be removed, cleaned, and placed separately. If the deformity was systemic, the entire body would be submerged, ensuring that future generations could see the case in its entirety. Lowering a body or body part into a jar was a delicate act. Assistants maneuvered carefully, adjusting the limbs, arranging the specimen so it appeared in the most illustrative position. This was not unlike staging a photograph or a portrait, except here, the subject had no say in how they were remembered. The doctors decided which angle best displayed the deformity, which position revealed the pathology most clearly. Once in place, the jar was sealed, the specimen suspended in its fluid like a ghost trapped in amber. The transformation was complete. The patient was no longer a patient. They were an exhibit. Labels were attached, usually handwritten, with details like case of sarcomatous growth, Boston, 1903, or specimen of hydrocephalus. Sometimes names were included, but often they were omitted, replaced by case numbers or clinical descriptors. The individual's identity was erased, reduced to the condition that made them medically interesting. To future viewers, they would be remembered only as a case, never as a person. For the medical staff, this ritual carried a sense of triumph. To them, preservation meant victory over time and decay. The disease that had baffled or fascinated them in life would now be available for endless study. Students 50 years later could still learn from this body. Lecturers could point to it as proof, as evidence of nature's extremes. The jar was not a grave. It was a textbook that could never be closed. Yet this victory came at a cost, one that those in the room did not recognize. The patient's humanity had been stripped away in the process. Imagine, for a moment, the silence in the room after the jar was sealed. The assistants wiped down the table, the smell of chemicals still hanging heavy in the air. The body, or what remained of it, now floated gently, its features distorted by glass and liquid. On the shelf, it joined hundreds of others, each jar containing a life reduced to pathology. To walk among these shelves was to walk among ghosts, but ghosts bound forever in glass prisons, unable to fade, unable to rest. The preservation ritual also served another purpose. It transformed the hospital into a museum. Visitors, students, and even prominent physicians from abroad could come to see these collections. In some cases, these specimens were displayed proudly, almost like trophies of medical achievement. The Boston Medical Museum, like others of its kind, was a place where the boundary between science and spectacle blurred. Some visitors came to learn, others simply to stare. The preserved patient, therefore, became both a scientific tool and a morbid attraction. For the individual, this ritual meant a second life, but not one of dignity or peace. Their body would outlast their name, their story, their voice. They would become eternal, but only as a case. The very fluid that preserved their tissues washed away their humanity. The doctors did not intend cruelty. They believed they were serving science. Yet the effect was cruel nonetheless. The preservation ritual ensured that the patient would never be allowed to vanish naturally into the earth. Instead, they were forced into an eternity of exposure, watched by eyes that would never know them as a person. The ritual ended with a simple act. The jar was placed on a shelf. A clerk noted its entry in a ledger. And then, life in the hospital continued as usual. Another patient struggled in another bed. Another doctor prepared another lecture. But for the individual sealed inside the jar, time had stopped. They had entered a strange form of immortality, one that spoke less of remembrance and more of possession. In that moment, the preservation ritual was complete. The patient of 1903 Boston was no longer alive, no longer even dead in the traditional sense. They had been transformed into an object that would endure, silent and unchanging, long after everyone who knew them had gone. Once the patient's body had been sealed in its jar, the journey did not end in the quiet of a storeroom. Instead, it continued into one of the most unsettling spaces of early medical history, the anatomical museum. These museums were not the hushed, polished institutions we imagine today. They were labyrinths of glass, wood, and shadows, rooms lined with shelves, cabinets, and cases where hundreds, sometimes thousands, of specimens floated in preservative fluids. To step inside was to step into a theater of death, where the boundary between education and spectacle grew thin. For the Boston patient of 1903, their jarred body was now part of this macabre collection, destined to be seen, studied, and stared at for generations. The Boston Medical Museum, like others of its era, had its roots in the European tradition. In the 18th and 19th centuries, physicians in London, Paris, and Vienna had built vast collections of pathological specimens. These were meant to be teaching tools, but they were also displays of power, proof that the institution had conquered disease by capturing it in glass. By the early 20th century, Boston, with its prestigious hospitals and medical schools, was following the same model. Its museums became repositories of the rare, the grotesque, and the extraordinary. A visitor could find everything from dissected hearts to skeletons twisted by rickets, from stillborn infants to tumors the size of melons. Each jar was a window into the strangeness of the human body, and into the suffering of the people who once lived inside it. The museum itself was often dim, the air thick with the acrid odor of formaldehyde and alcohol. Rows of jars caught the light in unsettling ways, reflecting distorted images of their contents. Some jars were cloudy, the fluid turning yellow with age. Others were crystal clear, preserving every detail of a twisted limb or bloated organ. Walking through the aisles was both fascinating and horrifying, like moving through a gallery of frozen tragedies. Each jar demanded attention, yet offered no voice, no story beyond the label pinned beside it. For medical students, these museums were invaluable. They were told that textbooks alone could not prepare them for the realities of disease. Only by seeing the preserved specimens could they truly grasp the scale and variety of human suffering. Lecturers would guide students through the collections, pointing to jars as if they were slides in a lecture. Here, a rare case of advanced syphilitic lesions. Here, a congenital deformity of the spine. And here, one of the most remarkable cases of cranial tumor ever recorded. Students scribbled notes, sketching diagrams, their fascination growing. But what they rarely recorded was the fact that each jar represented a life, a story erased by scientific classification. The Boston patient, floating inside their jar, would have been placed on one of these shelves, perhaps in a section dedicated to unusual tumors or congenital malformations. Their body, silent and still, became part of a curriculum. Each semester, new students would file past, some horrified, others intrigued, all of them learning from the patient without ever knowing their name. To them, the jar was a resource, not a person. The patient had become an eternal teacher, but one who had never chosen the role. Yet these museums were not visited only by students. Doctors, scholars, and sometimes even curious outsiders were allowed to tour the collections. In Europe, it was not uncommon for medical museums to become attractions, with the public invited to marvel at the grotesque. Boston's institutions were more cautious, but the line between education and exhibition was still thin. Whispers of the Museum of Horrors spread beyond the medical community, creating a mystique around the collections. To some, it was thrilling to imagine the rows of jars filled with strange and terrible sights. To others, it was disturbing, even obscene. But one thing was certain, the preserved patient was no longer hidden. They were on display, their condition eternalized as both a scientific marvel and a macabre spectacle. The presence of these museums also reflected something deeper about the era, a cultural fascination with the grotesque. The late 19th and early 20th centuries were obsessed with cataloging the extremes of human existence. Freak shows displayed unusual bodies for entertainment. Criminologists collected skulls of executed criminals, believing they could read deviance in bone structure. Anthropologists filled museums with exotic bodies from colonized lands. In this context, the medical museum was part of a broader cultural hunger to see, to classify, and to possess the human form in all its variations. The patient inside the jar was just one among thousands caught in this net of scientific curiosity and cultural obsession. For the doctors who curated these collections, the jars were not just tools but trophies. Each specimen represented a successful capture of rarity, a victory over the fleeting nature of disease. They could point to the shelves and say, "Here is proof of what we have seen, what we have studied, what we have conquered." The preserved bodies became monuments to medical progress, yet they were monuments built from human suffering, erected without the consent of those who supplied the raw material. And still, beyond the scientific value, there was something undeniably theatrical about these spaces. The dim light, the reflective glass, the floating forms, They evoke the feeling of being inside a cabinet of curiosities, an older tradition where collectors gathered oddities to impress and disturb their guests. The medical museum may have claimed to be purely educational, but it carried the same undertone of spectacle. Students gasped at the enormity of a tumor. Visitors shuddered at the sight of a malformed skull. The jars provoked fascination and revulsion in equal measure, a dual reaction that ensured their enduring allure. The Boston patient of 1903, sealed forever in their jar, embodied this paradox. To the doctors, they were valuable evidence. To the students, they were a lesson. To the rare outsider allowed inside, they were an object of horror and awe. Yet to themselves, if their voice could somehow echo from within the glass, they might have said they were none of these things. They were a person, with a story, reduced to a specimen in a museum of horrors. Today, when we look back at these collections, it is hard not to feel the weight of unease. The jars remain, many of them still on shelves in universities and museums. Visitors walk past, sometimes unaware that they are looking at real people, once alive, once full of their own small histories. The medical museum preserves not just pathology but also the disturbing truth of how medicine once treated the vulnerable. Every jar is a reminder that progress was built not only on knowledge but on lives reduced to objects of study. And so the patient's journey continued, from life to bed, from death to slab, from slab to jar, and finally into the museum. There they remained, suspended in liquid, a ghost among hundreds of others in Boston's hidden archive of suffering. Their story did not end with death, nor with preservation. It became part of something larger, something both educational and grotesque, the Museum of Horrors, where the line between science and spectacle blurred into a chilling display of humanity transformed into objects. Once placed on the shelf of Boston's medical museum, the patient's fate seemed sealed in more ways than one. The jar itself locked their body into an artificial eternity, but the label attached to the glass dictated how they would be remembered, or, more accurately, how they would be forgotten. A case number, a brief diagnosis, perhaps a year, that was all that remained to identify them. Their name, their voice, their relationships, the thousand invisible details that made up a human life were stripped away. The person had been erased, but the body endured. This paradox is what makes their story haunting even now. The patient was forgotten as an individual but never gone as an object. Each generation of students who filed through the museum encountered the jar without ever asking who this person had been. They saw the deformity, the condition, the medical oddity. They did not see the struggles of daily life, the loneliness of illness, or the final indignity of being transformed into a specimen. The patient's humanity dissolved in the liquid just as surely as their tissues were hardened by formalin. And yet, their presence remained undeniable. Every jar in that collection whispered, "I was here." Over the decades, the world outside the museum changed. Boston modernized, hospitals expanded, medical ethics slowly evolved. But inside the museum, the patient floated unchanged. Students from the roaring 1920s, the war-torn 1940s, the revolutionary 1960s, all of them passed by the same glass container, staring at the same silent figure. Generations of eyes studied them, but none met them as a person. In this way, the patient outlived not only their own time but also the memory of everyone who had once known them. Their physical form remained, but the essence of their life was gone, erased by the priorities of science. And still, something of the person resisted erasure. To look at the jar, even today, is to feel unease. The body inside is not an abstraction. It is not a diagram in a book. It is a person, with veins, skin, and a once-beating heart. Even the most hardened medical student cannot completely silence the awareness that this was once a living being. The unease is the ghost of their humanity, lingering in defiance of the label that reduces them to a condition. In this sense, the patient was forgotten by name but never gone from memory, never entirely erased from the consciousness of those who looked at them. The irony is profound. The very act that dehumanized the patient also granted them a strange immortality. Had they been buried in an unmarked grave, their story would have vanished completely. But because they were preserved, because their body was deemed valuable, they became eternal. This immortality, however, is a twisted one. It does not honor them. It imprisons them. They are remembered only as pathology, never as a full person. They are present but absent, visible but silenced. This duality reflects a larger truth about medical history. Countless individuals were forgotten in life: the poor, the marginalized, the sick. Yet many of them were never gone because their bodies were claimed by science. They live on in specimens, in case notes, in photographs stored in archives. Their identities are lost, but their bodies remain, testaments to both human suffering and human curiosity. The Boston patient was one among thousands, but in their glass prison, they embody the disturbing intersection of remembrance and erasure. Imagine, for a moment, the jar itself. Dust gathers on its lid. The fluid slowly yellows with time. The body within shifts slightly, caught in the currents of the liquid when the jar is moved. To one generation, it is remarkable. To another, it is outdated. At some point, perhaps, curators debated whether to keep it on display or move it into storage. But still, the patient remained. They could not leave. They could not decay. They were bound by the ritual of preservation to outlast even the doctors who had first placed them there. In this way, they haunted the museum itself, a constant reminder that behind every scientific triumph lies a silenced human life. To be forgotten but never gone is perhaps the most chilling fate of all. It means existing without identity, enduring without meaning. The Boston patient continues to live in this way, their bodies suspended in time while their story has slipped into obscurity. They are both present and absent, remembered and erased. And every time a student or visitor lingers on that jar, they unknowingly participate in this paradox, seeing the patient, but not really seeing them. The unsettling truth is that this is how history often works. The powerful are remembered by name. The vulnerable are remembered by body. The Boston patient joins countless others in a silent archive of the forgotten but never gone, teaching us not only about disease but also about the disturbing ways society chooses who deserves remembrance and who does not. The jar, then, is not just a container of tissue. It is a mirror, reflecting the uneasy balance between knowledge and dignity, progress and erasure. The patient may have been forgotten as a person, but they were never gone. Their body endures, their silence endures, and their story, once uncovered, forces us to confront what it means to remember. The story of the Boston patient cannot be confined to a single jar or a single institution. It represents something larger, an entire era of medicine built on the exploitation of the powerless. To understand the weight of this legacy, we must step back and see how widespread and systematic these practices were, not only in Boston but across the Western world. The preserved body in the jar is not an isolated curiosity. It is part of a long tradition where medical progress was fueled by lives that were considered disposable. In the 19th and early 20th centuries, hospitals and medical schools were hungry for specimens. The demand was relentless, dissecting cadavers for anatomy classes, preserving pathological organs for museums, collecting unusual deformities for private collections. But access to bodies was uneven. Wealthy families had the means to bury their dead with dignity. Poor families did not. For those living in poverty, the threat of posthumous exploitation loomed as constant as illness itself. If you died in a charity ward or a state asylum, you had little say in what would happen to your body. Consent was not a requirement. Ownership passed quietly to the institution. The Boston patient almost certainly fell into this system. Whether through poverty, isolation, or institutionalization, they became available to the medical establishment in a way that others did not. Once labeled a specimen, their identity ceased to matter. What counted was their usefulness to science, their ability to teach students about disease. In this way, the patient's fate was not chosen individually but imposed by a system that divided humanity into two categories, those worthy of remembrance and those worthy of study. This exploitation was not limited to pathology collections. Consider the notorious resurrection men of the 19th century, grave robbers who supplied cadavers to medical schools by stealing bodies from fresh graves, often targeting the poor because their cemeteries were least guarded. Consider also the infamous Anatomy Acts in Britain, which legalized the dissection of unclaimed bodies, nearly all of them from workhouses and hospitals for the poor. In the United States, similar practices thrived, and Boston's institutions were no exception. The patient in the jar is one link in this broader chain of systemic exploitation. The unsettling part is how normalized this exploitation became. Medical students of the time rarely questioned it. Professors defended it as necessary for progress. Museums displayed specimens proudly, presenting them as trophies of scientific advancement. To them, the patient in the jar was not a tragedy but a resource. The silence of the individual was drowned out by the applause of discovery. Yet, beneath the surface, cracks were forming. Communities noticed when their cemeteries were raided, when their dead were treated as objects. Families protested when hospitals claimed the bodies of loved ones without permission. Newspapers occasionally ran stories exposing the darker side of medical education. These protests, however, rarely shifted the balance. Science continued to prioritize knowledge over dignity, and the patients, like the one in Boston, remained trapped in their jars. The legacy of exploitation extends beyond museums and anatomy halls. It echoes in the 20th century with infamous medical experiments on marginalized groups, the Tuskegee syphilis study, where African American men were left untreated for decades, the exploitation of Henrietta Lacks, whose cancer cells were taken without consent and became the foundation of modern medical research. Though different in form, the logic was the same. Certain lives were considered expendable, their bodies used as tools rather than respected as human beings. The Boston patient is part of this continuum. They remind us that behind every breakthrough lies a hidden cost. For every discovery celebrated in medical history, there are untold stories of individuals whose suffering was erased in the name of science. Their exploitation was not accidental but systemic, rooted in class, poverty, and social hierarchies that decided who mattered. What makes the legacy even more disturbing is its persistence. Some of the specimens preserved in the 19th and early 20th centuries are still on display today, still teaching students, still attracting visitors. Museums wrestle with the ethical question: should these remains be buried, finally granting them dignity, or should they remain as testaments to history? The answer is not simple. To bury them might erase the evidence of exploitation. To keep them risks continuing it. Either way, the patient remains caught in a cycle of use, their body transformed into a permanent reminder of exploitation's reach. This is why the Boston patient story matters. They are not just an oddity from the past, they are a lens into how medicine advanced by dehumanizing the vulnerable. Their jar embodies the cold trade-off between knowledge and humanity, a trade-off that still reverberates in modern debates about consent, bioethics, and the rights of the dead. The patient silence forces us to ask, who pays the price for progress? And how many of those prices are hidden in jars, buried in archives, or erased from official history? Ultimately, the legacy of exploitation is not just about the past but about the choices we make now. The Boston patient can no longer speak, but their preserved form challenges us to look at medicine not only as a story of triumph but also as a story of shadows. Their existence inside a jar compels us to confront the uncomfortable truth that scientific progress has always been entangled with human cost. And until we acknowledge that, the exploitation continues, not in the same form, but in spirit. The jar is more than glass and fluid. It is a symbol of a legacy that refuses to fade, a legacy of power, silence, and exploitation. The Boston patient lives inside it not only as a preserved body but also as a reminder of what medicine gained, and what humanity lost.